Hi all, this is Minati Shah from Team 84. For our project, we wanted to pick a topic that was important to all of us as a team, education. We know for a fact that students of color are underperforming across schools in the US. Research has also led us to believe that increased spending on education leads to better outcomes, especially for students of color. This led us to identify two hypotheses for our project. Does increased school funding positively correlate with performance? And do minorities perform better at schools with more money? We looked at district level data from 2016-2017 as our sample, consisting of 10,000 rows. Our key variables were total revenue per school district that helped us calculate revenue per student, students enrolled by ethnicity, percentage of students passed, mean scale score, which is essentially an average of scores for math and literacy. We also learned that California is a minority-majority state, which in fact made it very unique for our project, with more than 50% Hispanic student population. Let us look at some EDA now.
First off, we look at school scores by ethnicity. We show that minority students, Black, American Native, Hawaiian, and Hispanics, were underperforming in comparison with white and Asian students. And our initial research pointed to a positive relationship between revenue per student and student scores, but that's not what we found. And we did not find a relationship between these two data points, regardless of the ethnicity. Wait a second. So is there no relationship between revenue per student and their scores? At this point we ask ourselves, what else might be influencing student scores? At this point, we were working with district level data, and we started to question how school funding was allocated. And we decided to expand our analysis to include other variables of interest.
We were concerned that having the data at district level could be hiding the effect of revenue on outcome. So we obtained the same data set at school level that increased our data set to over 40,000 rows. We added a variable called disadvantaged, which refers to students' economic background, and a variable called full-time equivalent teacher. We found a positive correlation between full-time equivalent teacher and student outcome, while revenue per student continued to show no meaningful correlation with scores. We also found that economic background is a good predictor of student outcome, with disadvantaged students underperforming regardless of school revenue. We also found that disadvantaged students underperform regardless of ethnicity. We then asked if revenue is distributed equally to schools. And we learned that schools receive higher revenue per disadvantaged student. Knowing that on average, these students underperform, that explains the no correlation between revenue per student and student scores.
To verify observations, we performed a t-test between the mean scale scores of disadvantaged to not disadvantaged students. We found that the difference were statistically significant. We also performed a pairwise t-test between the different ethnicities, where we found that there was a statistical significant difference between ethnicities with a high percent of disadvantaged students to a low percent of disadvantaged students, like Asian to Black, Hispanics to Black, two or more races to Hawaiian. But We did not see a statistical significant difference between ethnicities with similar percentage of disadvantaged students, such as American Indian Alaska Natives to Hawaiians, both with similar percent of disadvantaged students. A regression model also showed that being disadvantaged or not would be a better predictor for student success, already taking in consideration different ethnicities and other factors like full-time equivalent teachers.
Hi, I'm Stacy, and I want to take a couple moments to summarize our project findings and talk about lessons that we learned. So, the first thing that's important to note is that we failed to reject our initial hypothesis. Now, this is significant because what we essentially concluded was that there was no positive correlation between student outcomes and revenue, that minority students still tend to underperform even at schools that are funded better, and that these results are ultimately only considering the state of California and the data for just one school year. That doesn't mean that there aren't critical lessons to be learned. So, one of the first lessons is that economic background is a good predictor of ultimately how a student will perform. And while there's no relationship between student outcome and school funding, that doesn't mean that full time teachers or teacher equivalents don't show positive impacts on ultimately how a student will perform. Unfortunately, minority students still underperform when it comes to outcomes as compared to non minority counterparts. But I think if we were going to have more time, we had access to unlimited resources. I think there's some further analysis that could be done. So one of the first things that we could consider is sort of a wider range of time. For this project, we only looked at a single school year, but I think it would be interesting to consider more time and seeing if some of the conclusions we drew still held true. We could also investigate revenue distribution and sort of dig a little deeper to understand how much of the revenue is actually being spent on things that ultimately impact student outcomes, and then investigate why certain schools get more funding than others. I think the last thing to really consider is non economic factors that impact ultimately how students perform when they come to school. We hope that we've answered most of your questions in this presentation, but you may still have some lingering. So if there's a question that you still have that we didn't get a chance to touch on, please feel free to ask. Now's the time.